Hello and welcome back to another video in our UI UX no code pillar series. Now we've already looked at what UI and UX are, we've looked at the various different components that you can use to make up an interface and even tried them out in Webflow. But what I wanted to do is just try and give you a bit of an idea of, if you look at those beautiful, intricate UIs that are already out there today, how do you go from simply having a box of components into creating something nice, usable, and user-friendly? So over the next few slides, I'm going to take you through a few interfaces that are out there already today, and I really just want to give you an idea of the makeup. How have they taken those components, made it up into a nice interface, and how can you do the same? Now, these aren't going to be exact. I haven't fully, researched each screen that I'm going to show you. I've just taken a quick cursory glance at it and said, what components does it look like this screen has? What are they? How are they styled? And it's really just to try and show you that although you may not be a designer, maybe you are, but although you may not be a designer, it's a great way to see how you go from 0 to 1 and just to show you that it is possible. It's not completely beyond you. It's difficult to learn design on top of also learning to build software without coding, but I just want to try and just show you how it all fits together, bring it to life a little bit, and hopefully give you some hope that you can achieve it too. So we're going to start with the sign-in interface for Adalo. Adalo being a mobile app builder that I've referenced a lot throughout these various different videos. And the reason I want to pick this is twofold. Number one, there's a good chance you're going to use it, but number two, and a lot more importantly, it's a nice, simple, beautiful sign-in interface. It looks like almost every other sign-in interface out there from a structure point of view. And that's totally okay, because sometimes the right thing to do is to not reinvent the wheel. If you look at companies like Airbnb, Facebook, big companies with big tech resources, they have spent a lot of time and a lot of money on designers trying to make this interface work as perfectly as possible, trying to see how it works with their existing customers. And so it's okay to not steal a design, but to copy the framework on the bare bones of a design sometimes. Sign-in is a great example because there's no real reason to make it any different from anywhere else. The minute a user sees it, they know exactly what to do. But even across any other interface, if you're looking for inspiration, don't be afraid to look at other websites, because quite often the interface looks that way because of things that company has learned, and you can just learn from their previous mistakes and implement a UI that looks like your own, but certainly take some inspiration from elsewhere. So we start with a Adalo sign-in interface, and again, if you're building a sign-in interface, it probably should look something like this. So I'm just going to move myself out of the way. Now, I'm going to go left through to right. There's a lot of text on here. You might want to pause it and read it, and don't worry about following along with all of it. Remember, I'm coming from a background of, I know all these different design options, I know them all really well. You've obviously just had a preview of them at this point, most likely, but it's not really about the individual options. This is not an exact instructional video. I'm just trying to relate how this interface looks to all the little different bits and pieces that you have seen. So what we've got on the left, first of all, is a section component, and I'll probably draw on this just to try and help you figure out where I am. But this big kind of background over here, including these little dots, etc., this is simply a section background. And it's got a background image set to an SVG file of some sort of pattern that looks like this. Now, the reason I say an SVG file is SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphic, which is a fancy way of saying this image can be scaled up to any size you like and it won't lose quality the way that a logo or a picture or a photo would. So it doesn't get blurry as you make it bigger. And so you can find all sorts of websites, if you just Google it, that will give you these different patterns that you can use and you can go and try out. And essentially you get all sorts that you can just put as a background. It will look a little bit like this. It will scale to whatever side of the screen you want. And it's just nice and simple and easy. But all that is a section. Now next we've got our H1 heading text, which is just this little sign-in box here. And as we mentioned, H1, headings go all the way from H1 through to H5, H6. Clearly, H1 is meant to be the most prominent text on your page, which this is visually, but also this is the most important piece of text on there, right? Sign in, that's what the user's got to do. So it's a strong, clear direction. Now, that heading is sitting within this container here. So that container just goes all the way around here. That's a very crap drawing of a line, clearly. But essentially all this box is a container. The The border radius, i.e. the corners, have been set to at least 18 pixels. Actually, it could possibly be more. It could be 25 or even higher. But clearly the box has been rounded off, which gives it that nice kind of modern looking shape. And then they've applied a box shadow, or a shadow as we call it, to the box, which kind of gives it that effect of popping off. So the container's got a shadow, it's got corners, and as a result it just looks like it's kind of floating above the section background almost. I'm imagining that shadow will be just like the one that we did in Webflow, so it'll be, the colour of it will be black, the opacity will have been set down to something like 30-40%, and the blur will be set quite high, which pushes the shadow outwards the way you can see, and that's all there is to it. It's just white background, shadow, corners, and it looks amazing. Now I'll jump quickly up to the right to this div block just because it's kind of part of the container. So the little logo here with the Adalo symbol in it, all we've done there, if you remember from the Webflow video, is they've taken a div block, they have set that to be circular, so they've set the radius to 999 pixels, a circle, and by the way, in some other tools it could be less than 999, but 999 in Webflow turns it into a circle. They have then added a shadow to that, and again that just helps it offset from the section. And they have then set the background image to their logo. So that just creates a nice circular div block, logo on it, a little bit of shadow. Another thing they've done is the Z index. So you get this idea of the X index, which is just, kind of width. You get the Y index, which is up and down, and then the Z index, which is how far off are you from the page. You don't really have to worry about all they are, but if you want one element to sit on top of another one, the way that does, right on top of that container, you can add a Z index. Most tools that have support for it will just call it the Z index. You set it to the base, like every standard element is a border, I guess of 0, like that's where kind of the Z index starts, and then this might just be Z index 1, 2, 3, whatever. The highest index is the element that shows on top. So that's how they've done that. Depending on different tool, you might be able to just drag it. Other times you'll have to specify exactly where it should sit. Excuse me. So the back down to the left here, we've got this button. Now, button is clearly centered. The background colour is set to yellow. The label, they've written sign in and set that to black. It looks like they've put pretty heavy padding in on the left and the right. And there's various ways to do it. It might just be because the button is set to a certain size and the text is sitting in the middle. But you could achieve this look by putting a left and right padding in to the button or to the text label of roughly about 100 pixels. So that's just how you do that, nice and simple. We've got these text input fields, and first of all, clearly they've got a radius set on them. I've put about 25 pixels, it might be a bit less than that to be fair, it's probably somewhere around the 15-14 mark. And in order to achieve that sort of like quite defined line border, they have probably set the border to be about 1, maybe 2 pixels. They've set it to be a colour black or a colour grey, and then they've turned the opacity right down the same way you do with the shadow. I reckon that was probably like 70% opacity, maybe a little bit less. And then what they've done with the width of the box is they've set that to somewhere around 65 to 75% of the screen, and that keeps it that kind of nice contained way in addition to the centering. Now I've moved on to talk about the text blocks in this bottom one, and actually I'm talking about these input lines as well. One of the things that they've done is by default this email address text and this password text would sit flush on this line here with the input box, but actually what they've clearly done is set a margin, and therefore this email address is pushing itself roughly, let's say about 25 pixels in, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but it's pushing itself in, and that is as well. And then in terms of our bottom text here where it's bolded, etc., forgot password is obviously set to bold. I don't think the size is any different, I think it is just bolded, and obviously it's in capital letters, and it's set to green. Really, really simple there. Another thing just worth pointing out, with this input field, it looks like they've pushed themselves about 10 pixels away from the password field here, so this is about, it's probably more than 10, but either way it's pushed itself off from the field, so here and here, and these are obviously pushed off from each other as well. I think you've about 10 pixels between the label and the box, and then probably 30 or so between the box and the next label down. Your eyes might be better than mine, but that's just a rough guess of how it could look. If you were implementing this yourself, you would just experiment with it. So that's a fairly easy, simple layout. Let's look at something more complex now. Some of the elements in this page will be continued on this next interface, which should look familiar from a repeating data list. I decided, since we already looked at the main component of this, which is a repeating data list, that it would be worth us exploring the rest of the page because it's quite complex. There's quite a lot going on it. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. I'm not going to point out every single element on it the way I did with the Adalo screen because a lot of them we've already seen. You can probably start to recognise some of the Adalo elements on here. So let's just instead look at some of the unique bits and pieces. Now I'm just going to move myself, let me put myself over here for now. I know you can't fully read that, but first of all, the first thing to note is this screen is kind of split into, actually let me put myself down here. Oops. This is clearly split into three main boxes. We've got this bar here on the left, which appears to be kind of navigation. We've got our main bar in the middle, which is the tweet feed, i.e. a repeating data list. And then over the right, we've got a little kind of mismatch of different menus and options. Let's start on the left. Now, you kind of have two options here. This could be a nav bar component if you were building a Twitter clone and you're building a no-code tool, a nav bar might suffice here. But to me, this looks like a div block, a kind of container style building block. I think that the width has been set to 25% of the screen. I say 25% because I would have ordinarily have suggested 33%, but it looks like that middle box is a bit wider than the box left and right of it. So I think this leftmost div is set to 25% width of the screen. Each item that we've got within this screen, to me, it looks like another div. Within that div, I believe you've got an image for the icon, so next to explore, next to notifications, etc. And then I believe that each little bit of text is a heading, which is set to a link, and the div will be clickable. So you've got a fixed left nav bar right down there. The buttons are part of that, the picture's part of that, etc., etc. Next, if we look in the middle, clearly, first of all, we've got a repeating data list, and there's a few things to point out here. So this will be a div with a repeating data list inside it. Because the repeating data list scrolls for an infinite period of time, this this div will be set for the overflow to scroll. Now, if you've not seen this option so far, overflow essentially says when a piece of content within a box is going to go without that out with that box, or is going to go beyond that that component, what should it do? Typically, overflow will show as visible, and that's how you get text running off of a screen. You can also set it to scroll, which is what they've done here, which means it will just scroll until the content runs out, which in Twitter's case is never. Or you can set it to do various other things like hide the entire element and all sorts. So you kind of have a few options. They've set it to scroll, which means this is going to take on the appearance of two fixed divs and then a middle scrolling block that will scroll forever. So the left and the right will always seem like they're fixed to the screen, because technically this is just one single page. The whole page is never scrolling down. It's only this one box in the middle. And so the other thing that they've done here to achieve this border, it looks a little bit like they've put a border on each of the three panes, but actually they've only put it on the middle. They'll have set the border to something like 2 pixels. It will be grey with a bit of opacity, and that is what creates this line that runs up and down the left and runs up and down the right. Clearly you've also got a border running between each tweet as well. It looks like that will just be the bottom border or something like that. Or perhaps even the top one, because as you can see here, we've got this home part. Now, potentially the way I would achieve that is simply by putting home in its own div or container. I would put a bottom border on it, and that creates that simple line down there without creating a line on the top. The line that it's got next to home on the left and on the right isn't actually from that home container. It's created by this whole div block having a border up and down it in the first place. So remember, everything that you see either side of these two lines or inside these two lines is all part of the same div block. Home is in its separate container in that div block, and each tweet is inside that div block, inside that repeating list as well. Within each div block then, within each item within the div block, within the repeating list, clearly the tweet has got the text, which is going to be a variable that's pulling through from the database. Clearly the profile picture will be another div block set to 999. Width and height probably set to somewhere around 40 pixels. This will be starting to feel very familiar in terms of making circles. And then the background image of that circular div will be set to a variable, which is the user's profile picture pulled from the Twitter user database. For each little icon we've got around about a like, a retweet, etc., those will be divs that are clickable with an icon, a background image set as well, with the exception of this little one with the likes, which will be a div with an icon and a piece of text, which is a variable that will pull through the number of likes from the database. So that's nice and simple again when you actually break it down, even though it looks like a hugely complex interface. A couple other things to talk about. Let me just move my big ugly face up here. So first of all, on the right, as we talked about earlier under who to follow, we've got another repeating data list. Clearly it's one big div that's got rounded corners. It's got a repeating data list. The list will have a border set above and at the top. The middle repeating data item will have a border set in the middle. You've got a button or a link down here, and then that repeating data list is just pulling through users who do not have a relationship with the current user, and then limiting that list to 3 items. Now in reality, in order to do the kind of matching, Twitter will be doing a lot more complicated algorithms and stuff than that, but from a no-code perspective, keeping it really simple, that is just a list of every user who does not have a current following relationship with the logged in user, and as a result we're pulling them through, we're limiting it to 3 items. Now up the very top, last thing I want to point out, I kind of alluded to this earlier I think in the UI components lesson, but let's talk about it again. So they've got a search field here. You might think this is some sort of unique component, but it's not. Actually what it will be is a form, and within that form you're going to have a text input. That text input will be set to be the entire size of the form, but the form will be rounded. So it's got the radius set, which gives it that kind of rounded appearance. We've then got an image in there, which will be probably a transparent button, or the submit button that will be transparent. Instead of having words, it's got a little icon. The icon will be done in grey. You've then got very heavy padding, and what I mean by heavy padding is like a lot of pixels pushing in from the side to get that search Twitter part right in the middle of the box, or over to the kind of left anyway. So that's just how you create that, and it will just be a form that's set up that takes whatever input, sends it off to some sort of search workflow, and brings the user back to the right page. Last thing I want to point out, now this won't make a lot of sense unless you use Twitter, but if you do, when I click this little messages box down the bottom here, it would pop up with all of my direct or private messages, or my DMs. So that's a drop down because that's a little button. When I click that, it pops up. There's another repeating data list in there with all my DMs, and then if I click it again, it will hide. So it just works a little bit like a drop down. In practice, it's probably slightly more complicated than that. It's probably a clickable div that moves itself up when animation, etc. But let's keep it simple. So that's Twitter. Let's have a look at one final one, which is the eBay mobile app. Now, again, I'm not going to pull out every single element on this. A lot of this will be starting to look familiar. This left-hand bar here, you can probably immediately tell is a nav bar or a big div. Let's jump in. So, first of all, to this is immediately not a nav bar. It's too complicated for a nav bar. It is actually its own div, and I think that div will be set to hidden until the hamburger button, which you can see in the second picture, is clicked, and then it will show again when it will hide or show depending on when hamburger is clicked. Now you could say that's a drop down. It looks like it might be a little bit more complex than that, but essentially within here we've then got a very similar thing to Twitter, which is a bunch of different div blocks with an icon with a heading inside that gives you the name, notifications, messages, etc. These divs will be clickable. They'll be link blocks, as we sometimes call them, and then whichever page you're on, clearly the div will have a background of grey with the text colour set to blue, and the icon will either be a separate image which is blue, or they'll somehow set the colour of the icon to blue. There's a few ways you can do that, primarily by taking an SVG file, because that can accept a colour change. One of the other things to point out here, just because you'll see this quite a lot, so you've got a little notification symbol here of 2, you're probably really familiar with that from every app ever, and essentially the way you do that is you simply create a small div block. The div block is set to obviously hang over on the right here. It will be circular, so 999 pixels, the height of that is probably 20, the width for that is probably 20, and then within it we've got a simple piece of text. The simple piece of text is set to a white colour, and it will be a variable that will be pulling data from the whatever database table is storing the notifications, or whatever service is storing the notifications. So that's all that is. It can look really complicated, but it is just a div with a bit of text inside it. And you'll be kind of starting to see that the internet is broadly made up of a bunch of divs with text inside them and a couple of styling options. So we talked about the hamburger menu in the middle. Let's, on the right, talk about this kind of little setup here. It's quite interesting. There's a few things to point out. So what we have, let me just grab my pen to demonstrate some of this. So what we have around about here, I'm a terrible drawer. That essentially is 3 divs, so 1, 2, 3, which are inside a larger div. You can't really see the larger div, but this is a borderline of it here, and this will be the borderline of it here most likely. Now, what actually happens is I've said that is set to scroll. I got that wrong. It's actually this one over here that's set to scroll, but they both kind of act the same way if you look at the lines. I just kind of want to treat them as the same thing. So essentially what they're doing here to create this kind of half border effect is, if you imagine these are 3 divs, as I say, within a bigger div, here, then what they're essentially doing is putting a border on the bigger div at each side, only a top border at the top and a bottom border there. And then what they're doing is they're putting, if these are then individual divs, the box for this div is actually just this, because what they've done is put some padding here and some padding here from the larger div, and that pushes these 3 divs here basically into the middle. Which means if you then put a border line on the divs, and they've just basically put it on this middle one, then the border line only goes to here and only goes to here. So, it might start to look a bit mental the way I'm drawing it, but if you want to achieve that kind of half border effect that I know is really popular and common, that there is exactly how you do it. And so if you look over here, they've kind of broadly done the same thing. There's a little bit of a gap there, a little bit of a gap there. This kind of works the same way, but you see how this text is kind of fallen off the screen a little bit? That's because the overflow or the list is set to scroll. So this here is a repeating data list. It's obviously pulling out some sort of auction item database table. You've got an image, you've got text, you've got a little bit more text here of varying different sizes. This has got a big shadow on it, which is giving it that sort of floating appearance. And then, as I say, the overflow is set to scroll. It will scroll along the side, and that's how you do it, really nice and easy. The last thing just worth pointing out is we have over here a repeating list of available different items. Now, again, I'm sorry, I don't quite know how I've done this for the video, but this line should extend up to here, and I will fix that in the slides. But this repeating data list is essentially about this menu over here. And what we've got is various different little buttons. It's a repeating data list. Every item inside it is a button, or perhaps even a clickable div. Clearly they're all rounded with a bit of a radius. Clearly they've got white text inside them. And then whenever you click each one of them, it will take you to a different page. Sell now, deals, categories, etc. You can see again that goes off the screen, so it will just be a scrollable, side scrollable element. And that just gives you an idea really of how this eBay app works as well. So nothing hugely new here, but there's always these little visual flares that don't make a lot of sense until you learn them, like this little border gap here, this little scrolling effect here. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of insight into how it works. And I do apologise for a couple of the mistakes on this slide. They'll be fixed on the deck, which should be below. So that's all we're going to cover in this session. Again, I didn't want to make it a massive design lesson, but take a wee look through them, make sure you understand them. You could even try to recreate some of these interfaces yourself just to gain that UI UX exposure. But I think it really starts to give you an idea of how you go from that blank canvas into having these beautiful designs, because often the problem that people run into in no code, and actually programmers run into this with code as well, is they have great ideas, they understand the functionality, they understand the database, but they can never make it look good. And the problem you have today, almost how we talked about earlier in terms of attention, you're not just competing with your competitors in terms of UX. Every customer you have expects your app to look just as good as every other app on their phone. They expect it to look just as good as every website they visit. There is a continually rising bar of sort of how things must look and feel. In a very, very similar way, people no longer like it when they buy things off of a online shop and it doesn't come in 2 days, because Amazon has popularized this idea of 2-day delivery in countries like America and the UK, etc. So you're going to continually hit up against that barrier when you're building an app, which is, you can be amazing at the logic side, but you really do need to spend some time cracking that design side, or most of the time it's going to be really hard to get somebody using your app, loving it and being delighted with it, just like we talked about at the very start with user experience. So thanks very much for watching, and good luck building your UI interfaces out. We'll definitely have some more design lessons in the rest of the library, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you can